Gina Rinehart is the richest person in Australia, $38 billion, first on the list 6 years running, at the head of the largest private company in the country. So let's be clear straight away, because this is not a story about that empire collapsing. It hasn't. It is bigger than it has ever been. This is the story of the man who started it, and he never owned a mine, not one. Lang Hancock found one of the largest iron provinces on Earth, and every deposit that carries his name is dug by somebody else. The government stripped his claims. He took them to the Supreme Court and lost. He died in 1992 with the company in debt and his family at war, and the entire fortune rests on a single clause he signed in 1963 on ore he would never touch, for as long as the ore lasts. Before we go any further, if you want to keep these stories alive, I've created a book with the complete Australian lost factories. The Workers, The Gates, The Australian Maid, all gone. The link is on the first line of the description. Back to the story. A note before we begin. This story contains the names and images of Aboriginal people who have died, and it contains statements about Aboriginal Australians that are racist. They are quoted because they were said in public, on television, by the man this story is about. Chapter 1. The Boy at Mulgar Downs. Langley. Frederick George Hancock was born in Leederville, on the edge of Perth, on the 10th of June, 1909. He was the eldest of 4 children of a pastoralist named George Hancock and his wife Lillian. He went to school in Perth, at what is now Hale, from 1924 to 1927, and then he went north to the country his family ran. Mulgar Downs sits on the Fortescue River in the Pilbara, in the far northwest of Western Australia. To understand everything that follows, you have to understand what that place is. It is red, not brown, not orange, red iron-stained dirt over ranges of banded rock that have been sitting there for 2.5 billion years, one of the oldest exposed landscapes on the surface of the planet. It is enormous and it is close to empty. The nearest town of any size is days away by the roads of the time. The heat in summer runs past 45 degrees. The rain arrives in cyclones or it does not arrive at all. At 26, Lang Hancock took over the management of the station. He married Suzette Marley in 1935, and that was the whole of his prospects. A young man running sheep on marginal country in the middle of the Depression, in the emptiest quarter of the continent. The hills around him were full of iron. Everybody who looked at them could see it. A government geologist named Harry Page Woodward had written in the 1890s that the Northwest was, in his words, essentially an iron ore country, with enough iron ore to supply the whole world should the present sources be worked out. Nobody did anything about it. There was no port, no railway, no market, no reason. Woodward's report went into the government's files and stayed there for 60 years. Iron in the Pilbara in 1935 was a geological curiosity 1,000 miles from anybody who wanted it. There was a further problem, and it was the one that would define everything. Iron ore is heavy and cheap. Its value per tonne is low, which means the entire business is a transport business, wearing a mining company's clothes. A deposit is worth what it costs to move, and moving it out of the Pilbara in 1935 meant building a railway across several hundred kilometres of nothing to a port that did not exist, in a state with a population smaller than a single English city. No private company on earth was going to do that on speculation. But there was something else in those ranges, and Hancock had already found it. It was blue. It was worth more than almost anything else coming out of Western Australia by weight, and he was about to build a mill in a gorge to get it out. Chapter 2. Blue dust. Somewhere in the mid-1930s, in a gorge in the Hamersley Range called Wittenoom, Lang Hancock found crocidolite, blue asbestos. Asbestos in the 1930s was not a scandal. It was a wonder material. It was fireproof, it was flexible, it could be woven into cloth or packed into insulation, and there was very little of it in the world of the quality that was sitting in that gorge. Chrysolite is the most dangerous form of it, though nobody in Western Australia was saying so at the time, and the fibres are so fine that they hang in the air like smoke. The commercial logic was straightforward. Blue asbestos out of Wittenoom gorge was long fibre and high quality. It commanded a premium, and Western Australia had almost no other mineral industry worth the name outside gold. A man who could get the fibre out of that gorge and onto a ship had something genuinely rare. He pegged the leases, and in 1938 he shook hands with an old school friend named Ernest Wright, known to everybody as Peter, and the two of them went into business together. The partnership was called Handwright. There was no contract. It was a handshake, and it held for the next 50 years, and it would still be in court in the 21st century, long after both men were dead. Now here is the detail that makes Wittenoom Lang Hancock's story and not somebody else's. He did not simply own the leases. He built the operation. He designed his own machinery and his own plant, working out how to treat the fibre himself, and in 1939 he put up a primitive crushing mill in the gorge. Picture that for a moment. A 30-year-old pastoralist standing in a gorge 400 kilometres from the coast, personally engineering the machine that turns rock into loose blue fibre in a place where the dust has nowhere to go but into the air and into the men working it. The work itself was appalling, and everybody who did it knew it, though not for the reason we now know. It was hot, remote, and filthy. Men worked in a fog of fibre that coated the machinery, the buildings, and everything they wore. What nobody in that gorge understood in 1939 was that the fibre they were breathing does not leave. It lodges in the lining of the lung and it stays there, and the body cannot clear it, and decades later it becomes a cancer for which there is still no cure. Hancock and every man in that gorge worked in it daily, without a mask, for years. That mill was the first thing Lang Hancock ever built with his own hands. As it turns out, it was also the last. And in 1939 the world went to war, and the price of anything fireproof went straight through the roof. Chapter 3. Pig Iron Bob. The war was very good for blue asbestos. Warships need insulation. Aircraft need fireproofing. Gas masks, boiler lagging, brake linings, tank components, all of it wanted asbestos, and the British in particular wanted every fibre they could get. But something else was happening at the same time, and it would shape the rest of Hancock's life more than the war did. From 1934, the Nippon Mining Company, backed by the Japanese government, had been negotiating to take iron ore off Kulan Island at Yampai Sound, up in the Kimberley, and ship it to Japan. The plan was for up to 1 million tonnes a year. In 1937, Japan invaded China, and Australian alarm about the arrangement became very loud very quickly. On the 18th of April 1938, the Lyons government banned the export of iron ore from Australia, all of it. The official reason was that the country's reserves were believed to be too small to spare. The practical reason, in the shadow of a militarising Japan, was to keep Australian iron out of Japanese steelworks. 7 months later, at Port Kembla in New South Wales, waterside workers refused to load 5,000 tonnes of pig iron onto a ship called the Dalfram, bound for Kobe. They said they would not arm a country that was bombing Chinese cities. It was one of the few moments in Australian industrial history where a union stopped a shipment on a point of foreign policy, and it cost them 10 weeks' wages in the middle of the Depression. The Attorney-General, Robert Menzies, enforced the loading under the Transport Workers Act, and the men were locked out for 10 weeks before going back under protest. Menzies wore the name Pig Iron Bob for the rest of his career. That dispute was about pig iron leaving the country, and the embargo was about iron ore, and they are two different things, but they came out of the same fear in the same year. Lang Hancock spent the war in the northwest, running the station and the mine, and serving part-time as a sergeant in the 11th Northwest Battalion of the Volunteer Defence Corps. Mining and pastoral work in the remote northwest was essential production, and the northwest was not a quiet posting. Broome was bombed in March 1942 with the loss of at least 88 lives, and Port Hedland was raided that July. And in 1943 he and Peter Wright sold Wittenoom. The leases and the mill went to a new company called Australian Blue Asbestos, controlled by CSR, the sugar giant. Hancock stayed on as superintendent and kept a minority stake, which meant that for 5 more years the man who had designed the mill was still running the operation for its new owners. 5 years later, in 1948, after the relationship soured, he sold the rest of it and walked away entirely. He had been in blue asbestos for more than a decade, and then he was out of it entirely, and he never went back. 1948 is a date to hold on to, because 1948 is the year a doctor named Eric Saint went to Wittenoom, looked at the dust and warned the management that men working in it would have chest disease inside 6 months. Chapter 4. The Gorge. In November 1952, Lang Hancock and his second wife Hope were flying an Oster south to Perth. What happened next is the founding legend of the largest private fortune in Australia, and Hancock told it many times in his own words. The weather closed in over the Hamersley Ranges. The cloud came down and the ceiling got lower and lower. He dropped into the Turner River, knowing that if he followed it through, he would come out into the Ashburton. And in his account, on going through a gorge in the Turner River, he noticed that the walls looked to him to be solid iron, and was particularly alerted by the rusty-looking colour of it, and it showed to him to be oxidised iron. He had, he said, found the biggest iron deposit in the world, by accident, in bad weather at low altitude. It is a wonderful story. It has everything: the aeroplane, the storm, the wife in the seat beside him, the rain running down a wall of rock and making the iron shine. There are 3 problems with that story, and it is better to put all 3 on the table than to have somebody else do it. The first is the weather. Hancock's own biographer, Neil Phillipson, wrote a book about him called Man of Iron, published in 1974. Phillipson checked the flight against the records, and he states that there was no rain in the area of the Turner River on the 16th of November 1952, or indeed on any day in that month, and that the Bureau of Meteorology confirms it. Phillipson went further. He suggested Hancock promoted the legend in order to justify his claims to mining rights over much of the Pilbara. The second problem is the date. Most accounts give the 16th of November. Hancock's own company gives the 22nd. The founding legend of the fortune cannot agree with itself on which day it happened. The third problem is the iron. It was not a secret, and it never had been. Woodward had written it down in the 1890s. The country had been known to the Banjima people and their neighbours for tens of thousands of years. Lang Hancock did not discover iron ore in the Pilbara, none of which makes Hancock a fraud. It makes the legend a legend, which is a different thing, and legends grow around fortunes the way rust grows on iron. Every great fortune acquires an origin story in which the founder is touched by luck rather than assisted by timing. What he did was different from discovery and in some ways more impressive. He recognised what it was worth. And then he did the unglamorous part, which never makes the legend. He went back with a working prospector named Ken McCamey, and the 2 of them tracked that ore along the ranges for 112 kilometres and worked out that it was not a deposit at all. It was a province. And then he told nobody. For 8 years. Chapter 5. 22 years. He kept it quiet for a very simple reason. There was no point telling anyone. Under the embargo imposed in 1938, iron ore could not legally be exported from Australia. Not to Japan, not to Britain, not to anybody. Which meant that the largest concentration of high-grade iron ore anybody had found in a century was, in commercial terms, worth precisely nothing. You could own all of it and be no richer than the man who owned none of it. So the biggest thing in the Pilbara sat there in one man's head, mapped and unusable, while he waited for a government to change its mind. This is the strangest fact in the whole story, and it deserves a moment. For 8 years, Lang Hancock knew where one of the greatest concentrations of iron ore on the planet was, and knowing it was worth nothing to him at all, he could not sell it. He could not mine it. He could not raise a shilling against it, because no bank lends against a commodity the Commonwealth has banned from leaving the country. He simply had to sit on the information and wait, on a sheep station, for politics in Canberra to move. He was 43 years old when he found it, and 51 before he could tell anybody it mattered. It took a very long time. The men who could have lifted the ban included Robert Menzies, by then Prime Minister, and John McEwen, both of whom had been part of the government that imposed it. Politicians are rarely enthusiastic about reversing themselves, and the belief that Australia's iron reserves were dangerously small had hardened into received wisdom in Canberra over 2 decades. Hancock spent the better part of 10 years arguing against it. He wrote, he lobbied, he made a nuisance of himself with anybody in Perth or Canberra who would listen. And this is the part of his life where even his critics concede he was right, and almost everybody else was wrong. What finally moved it was not persuasion, it was arithmetic. Australia was running a serious trade deficit, and Japan, rebuilding, wanted more steel than it could make from its own resources. Cabinet relaxed the embargo on the 24th of November 1960, and the first export licence was issued on the 1st of December. 22 years. That is how long the largest iron province on earth was legally worthless. And this is the part of the story with no villain in it at all. The men who imposed that ban in 1938 were not fools or crooks. They were looking at a country that had invaded China and was building a navy, and at Australian ore being loaded for Japanese steelworks. And they made a defensible decision about the security of the nation. It also happened to freeze the future of Western Australia for a generation. In 1961, Hancock revealed his claims and began pegging in earnest, with the state's temporary reserve system letting a man tie up enormous areas of country on paper while he looked for somebody to pay for it. In January of that year, Rio Tinto sent a geologist named Bruno Campana into the ranges to find out whether the pastoralist was exaggerating. He was not, which left Lang Hancock, at 52, holding the biggest mineral find in modern Australian history, and no possible way on earth to pay for a mine. Chapter 6. 2.5%. A mine in the Pilbara is not a hole in the ground. It is a hole in the ground plus several hundred kilometres of railway, plus a deep-water port, plus a town for the people who work it, plus power and water in a place that has neither. In 1962, that is hundreds of millions of pounds, and Lang Hancock and Peter Wright were a pastoralist and an accountant from Perth, so Hancock went to the people who did have it. When the Australian board of Rio Tinto was slow to see the point, he went over their heads entirely and took it to the chairman, Val Duncan, in London. And in June 1963, Hanwright signed the agreement that this entire story rests on. They did not get a share of a mine. They did not get shares in a company. What they got was a royalty. 2.5% of the value of all ore mined in perpetuity, and not merely from the deposits they had found, but from the ground itself, for as long as anybody keeps digging it. It is worth understanding exactly what that means, because it is the shrewdest thing anybody in this story ever did, and it did not look like it at the time. Hancock got no say in the operation. He took no risk on the capital. He built nothing, ran nothing, and owned nothing. He simply took a small percentage off the top of every ton, forever, and let one of the largest mining companies on earth spend its own money proving how much there was. And crucially, the royalty was not tied to a single mine or a single pit. It attached to the ore, which meant that every time Rio found more, extended a pit, or opened new ground in the covered area, Hancock's percentage went with it, without him lifting a finger or risking $1. He had, in effect, taken a share of the future of the entire district and left somebody else to prove what the future was worth. Hamersley Iron was formed to develop it, and the money and the engineering came from Britain and from London's willingness to back a province nobody had proved, 2.5%, forever, of whatever anybody ever found there. Tom Price opened. Paraburdoo followed. The Pilbara became the largest iron ore province in the world, and Lang Hancock, who owned not one shovel of it, was paid on all of it. At the time, he did not see it as a triumph. He saw it as a compromise and a galling one. He had wanted mountains. He had settled for a percentage. Peter Wright, the quieter half of the partnership and by every account, the better negotiator and the sharper financial mind, seems to have understood better than Hancock did what they had actually secured. And for the next 30 years, he tried to build something of his own and failed at every single attempt. Chapter 7. What the Iron Paid For. Before we go any further into what Lang Hancock did with the rest of his life, it is worth stopping to be fair to him, because a great many Australians would say the ledger comes out in his favour and the numbers give them a serious case. Here is the thing about Lang Hancock that makes the easy verdict wrong. He did not get rich by taking something away from Australians. He found the thing that pays for a very large part of modern Australia at a moment when his own government had made it legally worthless. And he spent a decade arguing that ban into the ground while the people running the country told him he was a crank. Iron ore is now this country's single most valuable export. In 2023 and 2024, it earned $138 billion. Australia produced 930 million tonnes of it in 2024, more than a third of everything mined on the planet. And the public does capture a great deal of it. In the 2024 and 2025 financial year alone, Western Australian iron ore royalties came to $8.6 billion. That was 87% of all the royalty income the state collected. In a state of under 3 million people, that is schools, hospitals, roads and police, paid for out of the rock in those ranges. Hancock's own defence, recorded by his biographers, was that his most valuable contribution to society was creating employment and wealth that benefited the local and the national economy. On the evidence, that is not an unreasonable thing for him to have said, and any account of him that leaves it out is not an account, it is a prosecution. There is a further point his defenders make, and it is a fair one. The Pilbara today employs tens of thousands of people directly, and many more through contractors and suppliers, and it does it in a part of Australia that had no other economy at all. The towns, the ports, the railways and the airstrips exist because of the iron. Take the iron away and the northwest of Western Australia reverts to what it was when Lang Hancock was managing sheep on it in 1935. Now the honest ledger, and it has to be stated both ways. The deposits would almost certainly have been developed by somebody once the embargo lifted. BHP was there. Rio was coming. The state wanted it. What Lang Hancock did was see it earlier than anybody else, argue harder than anybody else, and accelerate the whole thing by years. And in exchange for that, he took a private royalty on public minerals that will outlive everybody now alive. Both halves of that are true, and neither cancels the other, which makes what he did with the rest of his life harder to explain, not easier. Chapter 8. The Man Who Owned Nothing. In the early 1970s, the Western Australian government took most of it away from him. Hancock held vast temporary reserves across the Pilbara, and successive state governments decided he was sitting on ground. He had no capacity to develop and handed much of it to companies that would actually mine it. From the state's point of view, the logic was simple enough. Reserves that are pegged but never worked produce no ore, no jobs, and no royalties, and Western Australia was in a hurry. He called it the Great Claim Robbery. He fought it in the Western Australian Supreme Court, and he lost. That is the shape of the rest of his life. He wanted a single, unified railway system across the Pilbara so that ore from anywhere could reach any port. It was never built. He proposed blasting new deep-water harbours out of the coastline using atomic explosions and was entirely serious about it, and dismissed concerns about radiation. People who objected were, in his phrase, eco-nuts. He founded the Westralian secession movement in 1974 to take Western Australia out of the Commonwealth. He bought newspapers, principally to argue his own case. He thought government should administer, in his words, the police force, the titles office, and a nuclear-armed air force, and very little else. He opposed Aboriginal land rights outright and held that sacred sites should not receive consideration if they stood in the way of development. He was, it should be said, an enormously effective political operator, despite never holding office. He funded parties on both sides of politics on the straightforward theory that access was worth buying. He led trade missions. He had the ear of premiers and prime ministers. Almost none of it produced a mine with his name on it. He was a man who could move governments and could not, in the end, move Earth. Everything he tried to build failed, and the 2.5% kept arriving anyway. And in 1981, in a television interview in Queensland, footage later included in the 1984 documentary Couldn't Be Fairer, he was asked what should be done about Aboriginal Australians. He distinguished between those he considered to have been assimilated, whom he would leave alone, and people of mixed descent whom he called half-castes and considered unemployable. Of those people, he said this: "The ones that are no good to themselves. I would dope the water up so that they were sterile and would breed themselves out in the future, and that would solve the problem." That is a verbatim quotation. He proposed sterilising Australian citizens through their drinking water on television, and the response came quickly. The Commissioner for Community Relations, Al Grassby, said in October 1981 that it was a proposal suited to Nazis. Lang Hancock never withdrew it. And all that time, 400 kilometres north, the thing he had actually built with his own hands was still doing what it had been doing since 1939. Chapter 9. Latency. Nobody investigated Lang Hancock. That is worth saying plainly, because it is unusual. There was no crusading journalist, no royal commission into him, no prosecution, no reckoning of the ordinary kind. He was never brought down, he never faced a court over it, and he never answered for any of it to anybody. What came for Wittenoom, instead, was the disease, and it took 40 years, because that is how long mesothelioma waits. This is the thing that makes asbestos different from every other industrial hazard. And it is the reason nobody was held to account while it mattered. A man could work in that gorge for 2 years, walk out healthy, raise a family, work another career, retire and die of it at 60. The gap between the cause and the consequence is so long that by the time the evidence is standing in front of you in a hospital ward, the mine has been closed for a generation. The men who profited from it are old or dead or have simply moved on to iron. The warnings were early. There was a case of asbestosis in the town by about 1946. Dr. Eric Saint gave his warning in 1948, the year Hancock sold out. In 1962, a doctor named Jim McNulty diagnosed the first case of mesothelioma ever recorded in Australia, in a man who had worked at Wittenoom. CSR closed the mine on the last day of 1966, not for safety, but because it had stopped making money. By then, something like 20,000 people had passed through that town. workers and their wives and their children, in a place the government had actively promoted as a good posting with a future. About 161,000 tonnes of blue fibre had been taken out of the gorge, and then, one by one, decades later, they began to die. Ray Adam worked the crushing mill in 1948. He gave evidence from a hospital bed, and he described the dust as unbelievable to see, all over the place, with the windows clogged up with it. He was asked whether anybody had warned them what it would do. Never in a million years, he said. He died of mesothelioma almost immediately afterwards. His widow Yvonne won the first out-of-court settlement anybody got. It was $60,000, and it opened the door for everyone who came after. In 1953, a photograph was taken of two small boys playing in a sandpit at Wittenoom. The sand was asbestos tailings. The mine gave it to the town. One of the boys was Philip Noble, who grew up to be a keen footballer and died of mesothelioma at 36. The other was Ross Munro, who became a high school principal and died of it at 38. More than 2,000 of the workers and residents of Wittenoom have now died of asbestos disease, according to the Asbestos Diseases Society of Australia. And the number is still rising, because the disease is still arriving in people who breathed that dust as children. Lang Hancock never accepted the slightest responsibility for any of it. For decades, he dismissed all talk of asbestos disease, denied any connection, and his proof, according to his own biographers, was that it had not happened to him. He died at his house in Mossman Park on the 27th of March 1992, aged 82. The company was in debt. His relationship with his daughter had only recently been patched up, and the war over what he left behind was about to last another 23 years. Chapter 10. The Clause. The estate fight came first, and it ran for a decade. Hancock had married his housekeeper, Rose Laxon, in 1985. After his death, his daughter alleged that Rose had hastened it. There was a coronial inquest, and it should be stated plainly how that ended. The coroner rejected the allegation and found that Lang Hancock died of natural causes. The matter settled in 2003. Then the thing he had built to outlive himself turned on the family too. In 1988, Hancock created the Hope Margaret Hancock Trust, named for his second wife, for the benefit of his 4 grandchildren, John, Bianca, Hope, and Ginia. It holds 23.4% of Hancock prospecting. It was to vest and pass to them outright when the youngest turned 25 in September 2011. Days before that date, the vesting was extended to the year 2068, by which time the beneficiaries would be in their 80s. 3 of the 4 sued their mother. On the 28th of May 2015, Justice Paul Brereton of the New South Wales Supreme Court delivered judgment. He found that Gina Rinehart had gone to extraordinary lengths and exerted enormous pressure and great influence to retain control of the trust, and that she had manipulated advice from the accounting firm PwC. He stopped short of finding a breach of trust. He removed her as trustee and appointed her daughter Bianca in her place. In December that year, she relinquished control, and the feud was effectively over. The rest of it ran on for another decade. In April 2026, the Western Australian Supreme Court confirmed Hancock Prospecting's ownership of the Hope Downs tenements, while ordering that royalties be paid to the Wright and Rhodes interests. A handshake made between 2 school friends in 1938 was still being argued in court 88 years later. There is a certain grim symmetry in that. Lang Hancock built his entire business life on informality, on handshakes and personal deals and going over people's heads. And the machinery of the law spent the better part of a century trying to work out what any of it had actually meant. So what is there now? Roy Hill, one of the largest iron ore mines in the country, built on tenements advisors said were close to worthless. Hope Downs, 50-50 with Rio Tinto. Hancock Prospecting, $43.5 billion in net assets, the largest private company in Australia. And Gina Rinehart, $38 billion, first on the list for the 6th year in a row. And 2 names on a map. One of them was taken off it. Wittenoom was declared contaminated, degazetted in June 2007, removed from the maps and the road signs, its power cut. The last resident, Lorraine Thomas, 80 years old, left in September 2022. The buildings came down from 2023. There is no town there now, and there is no sign on the road telling you there ever was one. 3 million tonnes of blue tailings are still lying in that gorge, across 46,000 hectares, the largest contaminated site in the Southern Hemisphere. The other name was put on. In 1999, they named the Hancock Range in his honour. He was not wrong about the iron. He was not wrong that his own government had made it worthless. He was not wrong that the Pilbara would pay for a great deal of what this country now takes for granted. And he was not wrong that somebody had to argue that ban into the ground. What he could not see, or would not see, is that a man is not only what he finds. He wanted to own mountains. He died owning none of them. The only thing he ever built with his own hands was a crushing mill in a gorge that has since been wiped off the map. And the only thing that survived him was a single line on a contract signed in 1963. 2.5% of ore he would never touch, for as long as there is ore.